At dawn in the early March 1943, Port Moresby doesn't look like a heroic poster. It looks like a wet wound on the edge of the world. Rain drumming on corrugated metal, palm fronds bent hard by wind, and a coral runway soaked until it shines like bone. The air tastes like salt and fuel and rust. Men move with that practiced speed that comes from fear being routine. Engines cough awake, propellers blur, ground crews shout over the roar, and somewhere in that noise, Major Edward L. Larner stands still for a moment, watching his B-25 Mitchell crews circle their aircraft like surgeons around a patient they're not sure will survive the operation. Larner is a squadron commander in 5th Air Force's Bomber Force, a man already hardened by the Southwest Pacific's ugliness, and he knows something the public never really understood about this theater. The jungle doesn't just swallow troops, it swallows time, supplies, and hope. Every crate of ammunition that reaches the north coast of New Guinea becomes another week of fighting in mud and kunai grass. Every troop ship that slips into Leh means another wave of infantry the Allies will have to dig out later with blood. And right now, out beyond the horizon, Japan is trying to push an entire reinforcement package through the Bismarck Sea. 8 transports escorted by 8 destroyers, carrying roughly 6,900 troops and their guns, their fuel, their food, their confidence. Allied intelligence has warned the convoy is coming, and that warning has the sharpness of a knife. You don't get to be surprised, but you do get to be afraid in advance, and that's its own kind of torture. The problem looks simple on paper and vicious in reality. Traditional bombing from high altitude is too slow, too generous. A bomb released from thousands of feet spends long seconds falling, long enough for a ship to turn, long enough for a destroyer at speed to slide out of the splash zone, long enough for a captain to do what captains do best, refuse to be where you aimed. Up there, you can take neat photographs of bomb patterns that look good in reports, tight clusters around a target, while the ship itself steams on, untouched, and your crews come home with flak holes and empty hands. That's been the story for months. Bombs in the ocean, ships still moving, and bomber losses climbing. At Port Moresby, the mathematics feel like cruelty disguised as professionalism. The higher you go, the longer the fall. The longer the fall, the more the ship can dodge. And the more predictable you are, the easier it is for anti-aircraft gunners to track your approach and bracket your formation. Larner has watched it. He's watched near misses, mistaken for hits. Watched crews swear they saw a direct strike only for reconnaissance photos later to show nothing but white water. He's watched bombers come back with one engine running rough, watched tail gunners too shaken to light cigarettes, watched the ground crew count holes in the skin and say softly, "You're lucky." And he has watched men not come back at all. So when the idea surfaces again, when the one tactic that sounds like insanity is spoken aloud in the tent, it doesn't feel like a clever invention. It feels like what happens when every safe method has already failed. Skip bombing. Mast-height attacks. The concept is brutally physical. Fly in at something like 50 feet above the water, fast enough that the aircraft feels like it's being pulled forward by its own momentum. Release a bomb with a short delay fuse so it doesn't explode on the first touch of the sea, and let that bomb skip across the surface like a flat stone. Once, maybe twice, until it slams into the side of a transport near the waterline, where flooding turns steel into a coffin. In theory, it's physics and timing. In practice, it is asking a twin-engine bomber crew to fly straight into a wall of guns at the height where a single mistake means you don't crash. You are simply erased. Higher headquarters has distrusted this sort of thing before because it sounds exactly like what it is. Reckless. Too dangerous. Too experimental. But the Southwest Pacific has never been kind to cautious doctrine. Down here, field improvisation isn't a personality trait. It's survival. And while Larner stands under rain at Port Moresby, he knows the convoy is already moving. It sailed from the Rabaul area and was spotted and tracked on March 1st. The battle won't be one clean clash. It will be waves of reconnaissance, shadowing, and attacks over March 2nd, March 3rd, and into March 4, with the outcome decided by how quickly air power can turn ships into wreckage before they can reach Leh. That knowledge tightens everything. Time becomes a physical pressure. You can feel it in the way men speak faster and swallow hard between sentences. On March 2nd, the first heavy punches land. High-level bombers strike the convoy from above, forcing evasive turns and disrupting formations. At least one transport is sunk in the day's fighting in many accounts, and the convoy's certainty begins to crack, but the ships are still moving. They push on through weather and smoke and the thin hope that speed will save them. For the men planning the low-level run, March 2nd is both proof and warning. Proof that the convoy can be hurt, warning that hurting it from altitude isn't enough, not fast enough, not decisively enough. The night between March 2 and March 3 is the kind of night crews remember for decades, because nothing happens, and yet everything happens inside your head. You lie under a mosquito net and hear engines that aren't there. You taste copper in your mouth. You run through the attack in your imagination until it feels like you've already flown it and survived it and died in it all at once. You check your gear for the 10th time because checking gives your hands something to do besides shake. You stare at your crew, men you've flown with long enough that you can read each other's fear without words, and you understand a fact that doesn't appear in after-action reports. Courage isn't loud. Courage is often just silence. Men climbing aboard because the alternative is letting someone else do it alone. When March 3rd arrives, the air over the Bismarck Sea fills with intent. This is the day the battle becomes what history remembers. The Allied plan is layered because a convoy is a machine. It moves, it shields itself with escort, it relies on discipline, and the way you break a machine is by forcing it to do too many things at once. High-level bombers come in to drop patterns that make ships maneuver, to stretch columns apart, to scatter spacing. Medium attacks add confusion. Then low-level attackers, Australian bow fighters and American B-25s and other strike aircraft, come in close, so close that the ship's gunners can see faces if they look up, and that proximity turns the ocean into a killing floor. The bow fighter's role is savage and practical. Strafe hard, smash gun positions, make anti-aircraft crews duck or die, make them choose between aiming and surviving. And then the B-25s arrive to deliver the part no one wants to imagine, a bomber used like an attack aircraft. In this theater, the B-25 Mitchell has been modified and handled in ways its designers never intended. Forward-firing guns, heavy machine guns, are mounted and emphasized so the approach isn't passive. You don't drift in like a target. You come in spitting fire, trying to pin the ship's gunners down in the exact seconds that matter most, because at 50 feet, your greatest advantage is surprise, and your second advantage is the enemy's flinch. The run-in begins miles out, with the convoy still a smear of smoke on the horizon. From that distance, it looks almost calm. Blue water, white wake lines, ships moving like chess pieces. Then the distance collapses. The convoy becomes distinct. Transports heavy in the water, destroyers sharp and aggressive on the flanks, gun barrels turning, muzzle flashes starting to wink in daylight. Your cockpit fills with the sound of your own engines and the shallow rasp of your breathing in the mask. You can feel the aircraft's weight in a way you never do at altitude. Down here, the B-25 feels like a living animal you are wrestling through the air. At roughly 50 feet, the sea isn't scenery. It is threat. Spray flicks the windscreen. A wave crest looks like a raised fist. Any sudden dip, any gust, any lapse of focus, and the aircraft touches water, and touching water at combat speed is not a splash, it's a violent end. And ahead, the ships are not targets. They are walls. Steel walls carrying men and ammunition and fuel, surrounded by a web of anti-aircraft fire that grows denser with every second. Your body screams to climb. Every survival instinct you've ever trained screams that the sky is safety and the ocean is death. But climbing early is how you die here, because climbing exposes you longer, gives the gunners time, gives them angles. The entire logic of skip bombing is commitment. It only works if you hold your heading. It only works if you accept that for the last few seconds you cannot dodge without ruining the release. That is why men called it suicide. That is why, when it works, it changes everything. The approach turns into pure numbers, speed high, altitude low, distance to target shrinking fast. The bombardier, or the man calling the range, shouts in yards. Thousands, then hundreds. Your guns open first. The forward-firing 50s hammer, sending tracers walking across a transport superstructure, across bridge windows, across gun tubs. You can see men on deck dive and scatter. You can see flashes where rounds strike metal. You can see gun crews trying to stay on their weapons while the air around them turns into splinters. This isn't about killing with machine guns. It's about buying seconds. It's about forcing the defenders to duck at the exact moment your bomb must be released. And as you close, the ship fills your windscreen and your mind tries to do something bizarre. It tries to recognize it as a ship, as a thing you understand, as something that belongs in the world of peacetime. But war doesn't allow that. War reduces it to geometry, a rectangle of steel that must be hit near the waterline. You hear the thump as your bomb drops. The aircraft lurches slightly as weight leaves. You don't get to watch the bomb like a spectator. You're already pulling up, already trying to climb away before you become the next wreck. Somewhere behind you, the bomb hits the water, skips, and drives into the hull. The fuse, only a few seconds, ticks down in a way you can't hear but can feel in your bones. Then the blast arrives like a physical punch. The shock wave slaps the aircraft's tail, kicks it sideways, makes the controls feel briefly loose, like the airplane has forgotten what shape it is. You look back and see the transport opening up, smoke boiling out, fire rising from amidships, secondary explosions rippling as ammunition cooks off. The ship lists, takes water, starts to die. And you realize, in a cold flash, that the theory worked. Not on paper. In the most brutal environment possible, on moving ships with guns firing back. Other aircraft are doing the same thing all around you. The attack is designed to happen almost simultaneously. Multiple bombers choosing different ships so the convoy cannot concentrate its fire. That's the elegance and the horror. Maximum efficiency, maximum destruction, no second chances. Some bombs strike perfectly. Some miss and skip away into harmless ocean. Some detonate short, throwing up walls of water that still shake ships and men. But enough hit that the convoy structure collapses. Transports burn, columns break. Destroyers whip around, trying to cover, trying to rescue, trying to fight and save at the same time. And then the convoy adapts, because disciplined enemies always do. By the second wave, the gunners have adjusted. They learn to track low. They learn to fire early. They learn that the most vulnerable moment is the last few seconds of the approach, when the bomber is committed and cannot turn without losing the shot. Shell splashes erupt like white geysers. Shrapnel rattles against aluminum like thrown gravel. A hit to an engine at this height is not damage. It's a sentence. Some aircraft are lost in those minutes. Lost so quickly that there isn't even time for fear to become panic. 1 second, a bomber is a shape over the water. The next second, it is debris, a flash, and then nothing but foam. No parachutes, no survivors. That is the truth of low-level attack. It is not heroic. It is exposure. Men vanish between heartbeats, and yet the surviving crews keep pressing in because the mission is still happening. Because the difference between convoy damaged and convoy destroyed is a handful of ships that might still limp into lay if you stop. Fighters appear above the cloud layer and dive, and for a moment the world becomes too crowded. Anti-aircraft fire from below, enemy fighters from above, your aircraft struggling at low altitude with limited room to maneuver. Escort fighters battle to keep the strike aircraft alive. Down low, the B-25 crews hug wave tops, using the sea itself as cover because at very low altitude radar and warning are weaker and attacks are harder to coordinate. You feel salt spray on the glass again. You taste fear like metal, and you watch the ocean swallow burning ships. The famous 15 minutes people love to quote is really a compression of something more complicated. An intense phase where the convoy's fate becomes irreversible and multiple ships are fatally hit in rapid succession, followed by continued strikes and cleanup across March 3rd and into March 4. The battle doesn't end when the first transport explodes. It ends when nothing capable of reaching Leh remains afloat. By March 4th, the result is stark in the summaries. All 8 transports are sunk and 4 destroyers are sunk. A devastating exchange that convinces Japanese planners that large daylight convoys within range of Allied land-based air power are no longer a strategy. They're a gamble with terrible odds. And then comes the part that doesn't sit comfortably in triumphant narration. Survivors, lifeboats, rafts, men in the water. In the days after the main attacks, Allied aircraft are tasked to search the sea and prevent survivors from reaching shore and returning to fight. And Australian commemorations note the long-lasting trauma this produced for air crews, because there is a moral difference between smashing a ship that is still a threat and strafing the aftermath. And war has a way of erasing that difference when commanders decide the future cost of letting men live is higher than the present cost of killing them. The numbers from the aftermath are heavy. Australian accounts often summarize roughly 2,890 Japanese soldiers and sailors killed or drowned, and around 3,800 rescued by Japanese vessels, while other summaries note that only a fraction of the troops originally embarked ultimately reached Leh in any meaningful combat condition. These aren't just statistics. They're the ocean turning into a grave. They're bodies lost under a sun that doesn't care. They're the war's cruelty made visible in daylight. And above that daylight, crews climb back toward home, scattered, damaged, alive. The return flight is its own test. Low-level attacks burn fuel. Combat power settings strain engines. Salt air is merciless. Damage you didn't notice over the target becomes terrifying over open water. You watch oil pressure needles. You listen to vibrations that weren't there yesterday. You dump anything non-essential because weight might be the difference between staying airborne and sinking. And if you make it back to Port Moresby, you land not in celebration, but in exhaustion. Ground crews run up and start counting holes. Intelligence officers start asking questions like accountants at the edge of a disaster. How many bombs released? How many hits observed? How many ships burning? How many aircraft missing? Reconnaissance photos arrive later and tell the real story because memory in combat is unreliable. Too fast, too loud, too full of fear. The photos show smoke columns, wrecks, burning hulks, ships beached and then struck again, and the dreadful certainty that an entire reinforcement effort has been smashed in the open sea. If you're listening to this and you can feel your heart rate rising the way it does when a story becomes more than information, do me a favor right now. Hit like. It tells the algorithm this kind of history still matters. And if you want more WWII stories told from inside the decision, seconds, distances, risk, and consequence, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because there are dozens of forgotten battles like this, and they only stay forgotten if we let them. Now back to Larner, because here's the twist the dramatic retellings often get wrong. You might think the man who helps prove a tactic like this would live long enough to explain it, to be interviewed, to become a legend in peacetime. He didn't. The war didn't give him that luxury. On April 30th, 1943, less than 2 months after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Major Edward L. Larner is killed when his B-25's wing fails during landing at Dobodura. Not over the target, not under flak. Landing. It's one of those details that makes the whole story sting. Because it reminds you what these aircraft were in 1943. Overworked machines, flying off rough strips, patched and flown again, pushed hard in tropical heat, carrying the hidden fatigue of stress fractures and combat strain. The war didn't only kill men with bullets and bombs. It killed them with metal failure and bad luck and the relentless demand for just one more sortie. And yet the tactic Larner helped validate outlived him. Skip bombing and mast-height attack logic spread because it produced results that high-altitude methods couldn't match against fast-moving ships. It also forced changes: more forward-firing guns, more coordinated multi-layer attacks, more emphasis on suppression, better fuses, better training, better understanding that ships are hardest to kill when they can maneuver freely and easiest to kill when you force them to move wrong. The Japanese learned too. They added guns, improved low-altitude tracking, increased fighter cover. The exchange rate shifted back and forth in later actions depending on preparation and circumstances. But the strategic shock remained. After Bismarck Sea, Japan grew far more cautious about moving large convoys in daylight within range of Allied land-based air power, because the sea lane to New Guinea had become a trap. That's why historians call the battle decisive, not because it was glamorous, but because it strangled logistics, and logistics is the bloodstream of war. Without supplies, garrisons wither. Without reinforcements, positions become indefensible. And the Pacific War was, in many ways, a war of starving islands and broken convoys as much as it was a war of firefights. The human cost, though, doesn't fit neatly into the lesson. Skip bombing demanded a particular kind of courage. Not the loud kind, not the charging with a flag kind, but the courage to hold a steady heading while the air turns into metal, while tracer rounds stitch the space around your cockpit, while you can see the ship's bridge and the men on deck and the gun barrels angling toward you, and still you keep coming because the release point is seconds away. And if you break now, you've wasted the run and maybe doomed someone else later. It also demanded a cost. Crews who flew these missions often carried psychological damage that didn't show in medals. Some couldn't sleep. Some drank. Some went quiet. Some refused to talk about it ever again, not because they were ashamed of serving, but because they didn't want to revisit the moment where combat blurred into something more troubling in the aftermath. War had rules until it didn't, and the Pacific had a way of sanding those rules down to raw survival. That's what the Bismarck Sea really shows you if you look past the clean summary. A chain of decisions under pressure, a collision between doctrine and reality, an innovation born from desperation, and an ocean filled with consequences. The famous image of skip bombing, bombs skipping like stones, sounds almost playful until you remember what it really means. 1,000 pounds of steel and explosive, thrown by a machine traveling hundreds of miles per hour, aimed at the waterline of a ship carrying human beings. There is no gentle version of that. There is only necessity as commanders understood it and the brutality that followed. So when people say, this tactic changed naval warfare, they're not wrong, but they're often skipping the hardest part. It changed naval warfare because men were willing to do what felt impossible, and because the alternative was letting thousands of troops reach a battlefield where your own men would pay later. That is the exchange war offers you. It doesn't ask if you like it. It asks only what you're willing to spend. And if you've stayed with this story to the end, do one more thing for me. Subscribe and leave a comment with the next WWII story you want. Pacific Air War, Atlantic convoys, night fighters, submarine duels, the Eastern Front in winter. These events don't stay alive on their own. They stay alive because someone chooses to remember them, to retell them, and to face what they really were. Not myths, not clean victories, but human beings inside machines, measuring life in seconds and yards, flying at 50 feet over an ocean that didn't forgive mistakes.